"Step away from the counter, Miss Santos." The voice came from the doorway, cold, authoritative, and the entire diner went silent. 10 black cars lined the street outside, their engines still running. Men in suits filled the small cafe, their polished shoes squeaking against the linoleum floor. Maria froze coffee pot halfway to a customer's cup. She was just a waitress. She brewed black coffee, remembered that the old man liked his toast cut diagonally, and never questioned the silver key he'd once handed her. But when the lead attorney opened a folder stamped H&W Industries, confidential, her hands began to shake. Whatever that key unlocked, it was about to change everything. What do you think they found? Comment below and subscribe to see how it ends. The brass bell above the door of Sunrise Diner chimed its familiar welcome at exactly 7 o'clock. And Maria Santos looked up from wiping down the counter to see Walter Hartwell shuffle through the doorway. His weathered hands gripped a folded copy of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, and his gray wool coat showed the careful patches that spoke of a man who made every dollar count. The morning routine had become as predictable as the sunrise itself. Walter would take the corner booth by the window, order black coffee and wheat toast cut diagonally, and leave exactly $3.50 on the table when he finished. People watching from their own breakfast tables across this working-class neighborhood might assume they were witnessing nothing more than an elderly pensioner stretching his Social Security check. But Maria had learned to notice the details that others missed. "Morning, Mr. Hartwell," she called out, already reaching for the coffee pot. The familiar weight of the ceramic mug felt solid in her hands as she poured, watching the steam rise in delicate spirals that caught the early light filtering through the diner's large windows. Walter nodded his appreciation, his pale blue eyes crinkling at the corners in a way that reminded Maria of her grandfather back in El Paso. She had been working at Sunrise Diner for nearly 2 years now, balancing her accounting classes at the Community College of Allegheny County with the 40-hour weeks that kept her small apartment rent paid and groceries in her refrigerator. The mathematics came easily to her. Numbers had always made sense in ways that people sometimes didn't. But the warmth of serving coffee to neighbors like Walter gave her days a purpose that spreadsheets couldn't provide. As she set the coffee down, Walter reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small object wrapped in white tissue paper. "Miss Santos," he said quietly, his voice carrying the slight tremor that came with his 72 years, "I've been meaning to give you something." The tissue fell away to reveal a small silver key, no larger than her thumb, with intricate engravings along its shaft. The metal felt surprisingly warm against her palm, and she could make out the words H&W Industries, Executive Access, etched in tiny letters along one side. Walter's eyes studied her face carefully as she examined the key, as if her reaction carried more weight than she could understand. "Keep it safe," he said, folding her fingers around the metal. "There may come a time when you'll need to open something important." The moment felt both casual and ceremonial, like receiving a family heirloom disguised as a simple gift. Maria slipped the key into her apron pocket, where it settled next to her order pad and the handful of coins that represented her morning tips. She had learned not to ask too many questions about Walter's occasional gestures of kindness. Last month, he had left a $20 bill under his coffee cup with a note that simply read, "For your textbooks." And when she had tried to return it, he had waved her away with gentle insistence. The other regulars at Sunrise Diner had their own quirks and generosity, but Walter's felt different somehow, more deliberate and mysterious. She refilled his coffee cup and went back to her morning tasks, aware that his gaze followed her movements as she served the construction workers their eggs and hash browns, the office workers their bagels and cream cheese, and the retired teachers their decaffeinated coffee with extra sugar. The breakfast rush brought its familiar chaos of orders and conversations, the clatter of plates and the hiss of the grill, creating a symphony that Maria had grown to love. She moved between tables with practiced efficiency, balancing multiple plates on her arms and remembering each customer's preferences without needing to write them down. The work was physically demanding, but it had taught her to read people in ways that her accounting textbooks never could. She could spot a generous tipper, a difficult customer, or someone having a genuinely bad day from across the room. When she returned to check on Walter, he was reading his newspaper with the methodical attention of someone who treated the daily news as serious business. The key in her pocket seemed to pulse with warmth, a reminder of the morning's strange ceremony. By 9:30, the breakfast crowd had thinned to a handful of retirees, nursing their second cups of coffee and sharing stories about grandchildren and doctor's appointments. Walter folded his newspaper neatly, leaving it on the table for the next customer, another small kindness that spoke to his character. He stood slowly, his movements careful but dignified, and placed his exact payment on the table: $3 for the coffee and toast, 50 cents for the tip counted out in quarters and dimes. As always, he left a small piece of paper under the tip money, and when Maria cleared the table, she found his familiar message written in careful cursive. "Thank you, Miss Santos. Your kindness makes the difference." She watched through the window as he walked down Carson Street, his figure disappearing into the flow of morning commuters heading to offices and factories throughout the city. The key remained in her pocket throughout the morning, a small weight that seemed to grow more significant with each passing hour. During her lunch break, Maria sat in the storage room behind the kitchen and examined it more closely under the fluorescent lights. The engravings were more detailed than she had first noticed, tiny gears and mechanical drawings that suggested precision engineering. H&W Industries meant nothing to her, but the phrase "executive access" implied a level of importance that seemed at odds with Walter's humble appearance and careful spending habits. She thought about asking Rick Morrison, the diner's owner, if he knew anything about Walter's background, but something held her back. The old man's privacy felt like something she should protect, even from her own curiosity. As she returned to work for the afternoon shift, Maria found herself wondering about the story behind the key. Walter had been coming to Sunrise Diner since long before she started working there, according to Rick, but no one seemed to know much about his life outside their morning interactions. He never mentioned family, never complained about money, despite his obvious frugality, and never asked for anything beyond his simple breakfast and the chance to read his newspaper in peace. The key suggested connections to a world beyond the diner's modest walls, but Maria couldn't imagine what role she might play in whatever Walter had in mind. She slipped the key deeper into her pocket and focused on serving her afternoon customers, letting the familiar rhythms of work settle her curiosity for now. 3 weeks after Walter gave her the mysterious key, Maria's carefully balanced world began showing stress fractures that no amount of careful budgeting could repair. The letter from Community College of Allegheny County arrived on a Tuesday morning, its official seal making her stomach clench before she even opened the envelope. Tuition increases effective immediately for the spring semester would add another $800 to her already stretched finances. She stared at the numbers printed in cold, bureaucratic typeface while her coffee grew cold on the kitchen table of her studio apartment. The mathematics were simple and unforgiving. Even with her 40-hour weeks at Sunrise Diner, she was now $300 short of being able to continue her accounting program. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was learning to manage other people's money while her own financial foundation crumbled beneath her feet. The situation at home added another layer of complexity that made sleep increasingly elusive. Her mother in El Paso had been diagnosed with diabetes the previous month, and the prescription medications that insurance wouldn't cover were costing nearly $200 monthly. Maria's weekly phone calls home had become exercises in reading between the lines her mother's cheerful updates about the neighborhood and the weather, carefully avoided mentioning the medical bills that were piling up on the kitchen counter. Pride ran deep in the Santos family, and Maria knew her mother would never directly ask for help, but the unspoken need hung between them during every conversation. The key Walter had given her felt heavier in her pocket these days, as if its mysterious purpose might somehow provide answers to problems that seemed to have no solutions. At Sunrise Diner, the morning routine with Walter continued unchanged, providing a small island of stability in her increasingly turbulent world. He arrived at exactly 7 o'clock, ordered his black coffee and diagonal toast, and left his precise payment with the handwritten note of thanks. But Maria began noticing subtle changes in their interactions that she couldn't quite categorize. Walter's questions had become more specific and probing, though always wrapped in the casual conversation of a regular customer. "Do you know much about employment law, Miss Santos?" He had asked the previous Thursday, stirring sugar into his coffee with unusual deliberation. "I've been reading about workers' rights in the newspaper, and it seems like young people today should understand these things better." The question had seemed odd coming from someone who appeared to be retired, but Maria had answered honestly about the business law class she was taking, describing the basics of wage and hour regulations she was learning. Yesterday's conversation had taken an even more unusual turn when Walter asked about her family background and her long-term career goals. His interest felt genuine rather than intrusive, but there was an intensity in his pale blue eyes that suggested he was filing away her answers for some specific purpose. When she mentioned her dream of eventually starting her own accounting practice to help small businesses in underserved communities, Walter nodded with what looked like satisfaction. "Integrity in financial matters is becoming increasingly rare," he had said, his voice carrying a weight that seemed disproportionate to their casual breakfast conversation. "People who understand numbers and can be trusted with them are more valuable than they realize." The comment had stayed with her throughout the day, echoing in her mind as she balanced the diner's daily receipts and counted the tip money that would help cover her grocery bill. The real shock came when Rick Morrison gathered the staff together after the Tuesday morning rush to deliver news that hit like a physical blow. Sunrise Diner would be closing at the end of the month. The building's owner had decided to sell to a development company that planned to tear down the entire block for a luxury condominium project. Rick's weathered face showed the strain of a man who had poured 20 years of his life into the small restaurant, and his voice cracked slightly as he explained that he couldn't afford to relocate and start over at his age. "I'm sorry, kids," he said, looking directly at Maria and the other 3 employees who had become like family over the years. "I know this doesn't give you much time to find something else, but I wanted you to hear it from me before the rumors started flying." The mathematics of her situation suddenly became even more impossible. Without the diner job, she would lose both her income and the health insurance that came with it. That afternoon, as Maria mechanically went through the motions of serving customers who didn't yet know they were witnessing the final weeks of a neighborhood institution, she noticed something that sent a chill down her spine. A man in an expensive charcoal suit was sitting in a car across the street, apparently reading a newspaper, but frequently glancing toward the diner's windows. The car itself seemed out of place in their working-class neighborhood, a black sedan with tinted windows that probably cost more than most of their customers earned in a year. When Walter arrived for his usual breakfast the next morning, the man was still there, and Maria watched through the window as Walter's gaze found the car immediately upon entering. The old man's expression didn't change, but something in his posture suggested he was neither surprised nor concerned by the surveillance. During their conversation that morning, Walter's questions took on an even more specific focus that made Maria wonder if he somehow knew about her financial troubles. "Have you ever had to deal with workplace harassment or unfair treatment?" he asked, buttering his toast with careful precision. "I'm curious about how well young people understand their legal protections these days." When Maria mentioned that she had been thinking about employment law lately due to her business classes, Walter nodded thoughtfully. "Knowledge is power," he said simply, "especially when someone tries to take advantage of people who don't know their rights." The conversation felt like preparation for something, though Maria couldn't imagine what Walter might be preparing her for. The strange phone call came that evening as Maria was reviewing her accounting homework and trying to figure out how to survive the next few months without steady income. The caller ID showed H&W Legal Department, and her heart rate spiked as she remembered the key in her jewelry box upstairs. The voice on the other end was professional and courteous, asking to confirm her employment at Sunrise Diner and her current address. When Maria asked who was calling and why they needed the information, the woman simply said it was routine verification for our records, and hung up after Maria confirmed the details. The call lasted less than 2 minutes, but it left her with the unsettling feeling that forces beyond her understanding were moving pieces on a board where she didn't even know she was playing. The next morning brought another surprise when Maria arrived at work to find an envelope taped to the staff break room door with her name written in Walter's familiar cursive handwriting. Inside was a business card for Henderson and Associates attorneys at law, along with a brief note. "Miss Santos, if you ever need legal advice about employment matters, these people are trustworthy and fair. Sometimes it helps to know your options before you need them." The timing felt too coincidental to be casual. Walter somehow knew about the diner's closing before Rick had made the official announcement to the staff. As she slipped the business card into her wallet next to her student ID and insurance card, Maria began to suspect that her elderly customer might be more than he appeared to be. The surveillance continued throughout the week, with the black sedan appearing at different times and locations around her neighborhood. Maria began varying her route home from work and paying attention to whether she was being followed, a precaution that felt simultaneously paranoid and necessary. The man in the expensive suit never approached her directly, but his presence felt protective rather than threatening, as if someone wanted to ensure her safety without revealing their identity. When she mentioned the situation to Rick during a quiet moment between customers, he frowned and said he had noticed the same car parked outside during Walter's breakfast visits. "That old guy's got more going on than he lets on," Rick observed, wiping down glasses with practiced efficiency. "I've always suspected there was more to his story, but he pays his bills and treats everyone with respect. So, I never pried." The comment reinforced Maria's growing conviction that Walter's simple appearance masked a more complex reality that was somehow connected to her own uncertain future. The call came on a gray Thursday morning in November, when Pittsburgh's autumn had settled into the kind of persistent drizzle that made the city feel smaller and more intimate. Maria was getting ready for her morning shift at Sunrise Diner, braiding her dark hair back and checking that Walter's key was safely tucked in her jewelry box, when her phone rang with an unfamiliar number. The voice on the other end was gentle but formal, introducing himself as Thomas Henderson from Henderson & Associates, the same law firm whose business card Walter had given her weeks earlier. "Miss Santos," he said carefully, "I'm afraid I have some difficult news to share with you. Walter Hartwell passed away yesterday evening from a sudden heart attack. He had specified that you should be contacted immediately, and there are some important matters we need to discuss regarding his estate." The words hit Maria like a physical blow, and she found herself sitting heavily on her unmade bed, struggling to process what she was hearing. Altero gone, the man who had been such a steady presence in her daily routine, who had seemed frail but fundamentally solid, like an old building that had weathered too many storms to fall now. Mr. Henderson's voice continued, explaining that Walter had left very specific instructions about how his affairs should be handled, and that Maria's presence was required at his office that afternoon to discuss matters that couldn't be addressed over the phone. The lawyer's tone suggested urgency mixed with sympathy. And when Maria asked why Walter would have included her in his estate planning, Mr. Henderson simply said, "I think it would be better if we discussed the details in person. Can you meet me at 2 o'clock this afternoon?" The morning shift at Sunrise Diner felt surreal, like moving through a world that had fundamentally changed overnight, but looked exactly the same. Maria went through the motions of serving coffee and taking orders, but her mind kept returning to Walter's empty corner booth by the window. The other regulars noticed his absence. Mrs. Peterson asked if he was feeling under the weather, and Frank, the construction foreman, wondered aloud if Walter had finally decided to sleep in for once. Maria couldn't bring herself to tell them the truth, partly because she was still processing it herself, and partly because she felt like Walter's death was somehow her news to bear alone. Rick Morrison noticed her distraction and told her to take the afternoon off, assuming she was still stressed about the diner's impending closure and her financial troubles. Henderson & Associates occupied the 15th floor of a downtown office building that Maria had walked past countless times, but never entered. The elevator ride up felt like ascending into a different world. One of marble lobbies and brass fixtures that spoke of serious money and important decisions. Thomas Henderson turned out to be a man in his 50s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. The sort of person who probably charged $300 an hour, but genuinely cared about his client's well-being. His office overlooked the confluence of Pittsburgh's three rivers, and Maria found herself staring out at the water while trying to steady her emotions for whatever was coming next. "Miss Santos," Mr. Henderson began settling behind his mahogany desk with a thick file folder. "What I'm about to tell you is going to be quite shocking, and I want you to know that everything has been thoroughly verified and documented." The first revelation was Walter's true identity. Walter Hartwell wasn't a retired factory worker living on Social Security. He was the founder and majority owner of H&W Industries, one of Pennsylvania's largest medical equipment manufacturers, with annual revenues exceeding $400 million. The company specialized in precision instruments for hospitals and surgical centers, employing over 1,500 people across 3 states. Mr. Henderson showed her photographs of Walter in business suits, cutting ribbons at factory openings, and shaking hands with governors and senators. The contrast between these images and the humble man she had served coffee to every morning was so jarring that Maria initially wondered if there had been some mistake. But the lawyer's documentation was thorough and unambiguous. Walter Hartwell had been one of the wealthiest men in Pennsylvania, and he had spent the last 2 years of his life pretending to be someone else. The second revelation was even more staggering. Walter had left 40% of his company's shares to Maria Santos, along with a personal trust fund worth $12 million, and very specific instructions about how she should assume control of her inheritance. The legal documents were complex, but Mr. Henderson explained the basic terms with patient clarity. Maria would need to work at H&W Industries for 6 months in a training capacity, learning the business from the ground up before she could take her seat on the board of directors and begin exercising her voting rights as a major shareholder. During this transition period, she would receive a salary of $150,000 annually, along with full benefits and access to the company's educational resources. The conditions weren't punitive, they were protective, ensuring that she would be prepared for the responsibilities that came with her new position. As Mr. Henderson spoke, Maria's mind struggled to process numbers that seemed to exist in a completely different universe from her daily reality of counting tip money and calculating tuition payments. 40% of a company worth hundreds of millions of dollars. A trust fund that exceeded anything she had ever imagined possessing. A salary that was more than triple what she had hoped to earn after graduating with her accounting degree. The mathematics were straightforward, but the implications felt impossible to grasp. Why me? She finally managed to ask, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm just a waitress. I served him coffee and listened to his stories. Why would he leave me anything, let alone this? Mr. Henderson's expression softened as he opened another section of Walter's file. Walter was a very deliberate man, Miss Santos. Nothing he did was random or impulsive. For the past 5 years, he had been systematically testing people, servers, taxi drivers, retail clerks, healthcare workers, looking for someone who demonstrated consistent integrity when they thought no one important was watching. The lawyer explained that Walter had used private investigators to verify the character and background of potential candidates, observing how they treated customers, handled money, and responded to ethical dilemmas. 12 people had made it to the final evaluation stage over the years, but only Maria had passed every test Walter had devised. He was particularly impressed, Mr. Henderson continued, by an incident 6 months ago, when you refused a $50 tip from a customer who was clearly intoxicated and trying to get you to serve him alcohol. The memory came flooding back, a business traveler who had been drinking heavily and kept offering her increasingly large tips to bring him more beer. Maria had gently but firmly refused to serve him additional alcohol and had called him a taxi, instead returning his money and explaining that his safety was more important than her tips. She had thought nothing of it at the time, just another night of dealing with difficult customers, but apparently Walter had been watching from his corner booth. Mr. Henderson pulled out a small recording device and played Walter's voice explaining his decision. Miss Santos understands that true integrity isn't about grand gestures, it's about doing the right thing in small moments when no one would blame you for taking the easier path. She has consistently demonstrated financial honesty, compassion for others, and the kind of moral courage that can't be taught or faked. As the lawyer continued explaining the legal framework of Walter's request, Maria's attention was drawn to a familiar object sitting on the conference table. It was a silver key identical to the one Walter had given her weeks earlier, down to the intricate engravings and the H&W Industries Executive Access inscription. Mr. Henderson noticed her recognition and smiled. Walter mentioned that he had given you the master key to his private office. He wanted you to have it before he revealed his true identity, as a gesture of trust and a symbol of the access he was granting you to his world. That key opens his personal workspace at H&W Industries, where he kept detailed records of his decision-making process and extensive notes about the company's operations. He intended it to be your starting point for understanding the business you're inheriting. The weight of responsibility that came with the key, and everything it represented felt overwhelming. But Maria also sensed something else emerging beneath her shock and confusion. A spark of excitement about possibilities she had never allowed herself to imagine. Walter hadn't just left her money. He had left her the tools and opportunity to build something meaningful, to use her skills and values, to make a difference in ways that extended far beyond balancing small business books. The key in her pocket suddenly felt less like a mystery, and more like a doorway, one that Walter had been preparing her to walk through from the moment she had first served him coffee with genuine kindness rather than mere professional courtesy. As Mr. Henderson handed her copies of the legal documents and explained the next steps in the process, Maria realized that Walter's death marked not just the end of their daily breakfast routine, but the beginning of a journey that would test everything she thought she knew about herself and her capabilities. The humble waitress who had worried about tuition payments and medical bills was about to become one of the most powerful people in Pennsylvania's business community, and she would need to prove herself worthy of Walter's faith in ways she was only beginning to understand. The H&W Industries headquarters stood like a glass and steel monument to American industrial success, its 32 floors rising from Pittsburgh's Strip District with the kind of architectural confidence that spoke of decades of profitable quarters and expanding market share. Maria stood on the sidewalk outside the main entrance on Monday morning, clutching Walter's master key and fighting the urge to turn around and pretend this was all an elaborate dream. The employees streaming through the revolving doors wore expensive suits and carried leather briefcases, their conversations peppered with industry jargon and casual references to million-dollar contracts. She had dressed in her best interview outfit, a navy blazer from Target and black slacks that had served her well during job hunts, but she felt like an imposter preparing to infiltrate a world where she didn't belong. The security guard at the main desk recognized Walter's key immediately, his demeanor shifting from polite professionalism to something approaching reverence when he realized what Maria was carrying. "Mr. Hartwell's private office is on the 28th floor," he explained, his voice lowered as if discussing sacred ground. "The elevator bank on the left will take you directly there. The access code for his floor is 4792. As the elevator climbed silently through the building's layers of corporate hierarchy, Maria caught glimpses through the glass walls of conference rooms where serious-looking people gestured at projection screens and whiteboards covered with charts and graphs. Each floor represented millions of dollars in annual revenue, hundreds of employees' livelihoods, and decisions that rippled through communities across 3 states. Walter's private office occupied a corner of the 28th floor, its walls lined with mahogany bookshelves and awards from medical associations and business organizations. The space felt more like a scholar's study than a corporate executive's workspace, with careful attention to detail that reflected the same methodical personality Maria had observed during their breakfast conversations. His desk was clear except for a single manila folder marked "For Maria Santos" in his familiar handwriting, and a framed photograph of a much younger Walter shaking hands with a man in a white coat outside what appeared to be a hospital. The master key unlocked not just the office door, but a series of file cabinets that contained what amounted to Walter's complete business philosophy and operational methodology. The manila folder contained a letter written in Walter's careful cursive, explaining his decision-making process with the same attention to detail he had brought to everything else in his life. "My dear Miss Santos," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then my heart has finally given out, and you are beginning to understand the magnitude of what I am asking you to shoulder. I do not make this request lightly, nor do I expect you to accept it without understanding exactly what it entails." The letter went on to explain that H&W Industries had been built on a foundation of ethical business practices and genuine concern for employee welfare principles that Walter feared were becoming increasingly rare in American corporate culture. The file cabinets revealed the scope of Walter's systematic approach to evaluating potential successors, and Maria felt her cheeks burn as she realized how thoroughly her life had been investigated over the past 2 years. There were photographs of her walking to class, copies of her academic transcripts, and detailed reports from private investigators documenting her interactions with customers, classmates, and neighbors. One folder contained transcripts of conversations she had never known were being recorded, discussions with fellow students about ethical dilemmas in business class. her patient explanations to elderly customers about their bills at the diner, and even her phone calls home to check on her mother's health. The most revealing documents were Walter's detailed profiles of the 11 other candidates he had considered over the 5-year selection process. Each file told the story of someone who had initially impressed him with their apparent integrity and competence, only to fail crucial tests of character when pressured by difficult circumstances. A nurse who had accepted bribes from pharmaceutical representatives. A taxi driver who had systematically overcharged elderly passengers. A retail manager who had falsified inventory reports to cover theft by friends and family members. Walter's notes showed disappointment rather than judgment, reflecting his understanding that ethical compromises often began with small rationalizations that grew into larger betrayals over time. The business education materials Walter had prepared for her transition were comprehensive and daunting. He had assembled detailed financial reports from the past 5 years, organizational charts showing every department and division, and strategic plans for expanding into new markets and technologies. H&W Industries manufactured everything from surgical instruments to diagnostic equipment with research and development budgets that exceeded the annual revenues of many smaller companies. The complexity was overwhelming, but Walter's notes provided a roadmap for understanding how each piece fit into the larger puzzle of running a corporation that balanced profitability with social responsibility. Maria's first official day as executive trainee at H&W Industries began with Richard Blackwood assigning her to review expense reports from the company's satellite offices, a task he described with barely concealed condescension as getting familiar with basic corporate accounting procedures. The stack of files on her temporary desk represented 3 months of receipts, invoices, and reimbursement requests from locations in Ohio, West Virginia, and Western Pennsylvania. Most executives would have assigned this tedious work to a junior accountant, but Blackwood seemed determined to keep Maria occupied with menial tasks that would demonstrate her lack of qualification for serious corporate responsibility. The irregularities jumped out at her within the first hour of careful examination. Consulting fees that appeared monthly like clockwork, always in amounts just under the $10,000 threshold that would require additional approval signatures. Business meals at restaurants that didn't exist when she checked their supposed addresses online. Travel expenses for conferences that had been canceled or never scheduled. Each individual discrepancy was small enough to avoid attention, but taken together they represented a systematic pattern of financial manipulation that had been carefully designed to fly beneath the radar of routine auditing procedures. The breakthrough came when she noticed that many of the questionable expenses were being processed through a consulting company called Pinnacle Business Solutions, which claimed to provide strategic advisory services, but had no visible online presence or legitimate business address. The invoices were professionally formatted and included detailed descriptions of services supposedly provided, but when Maria cross-referenced the dates with H&W Industries' internal calendar, she discovered that many of the claimed consultations had occurred during periods when the company's offices were closed for holidays or when key personnel were traveling. Working late into the evening in Walter's private office, Maria used the computer access he had arranged for her to dig deeper into H&W Industries' financial records. The consulting payments to Pinnacle Business Solutions totaled over $2.3 million over the past 18 months, representing a significant drain on the company's resources that should have triggered oversight from the board of directors. When she traced the banking information for Pinnacle Business Solutions through public records databases, she discovered that the company had been incorporated in Delaware by a law firm that specialized in creating shell corporations for clients who preferred to remain anonymous. The connection to Richard Blackwood became clear when Maria accessed Walter's private investigator files and compared the timeline of Pinnacle's formation with Blackwood's personal financial records. The CFO had purchased a new BMW and a vacation home in the Hamptons within months of Pinnacle's first payments from H&W Industries, despite declaring a salary that wouldn't support such expensive acquisitions. Bank records showed regular deposits to Blackwood's personal accounts from a holding company that owned Pinnacle, creating a money trail that would be difficult to explain as legitimate business income. Armed with this evidence, Maria faced a decision that would define her future at H&W Industries and test everything Walter had believed about her character. The confrontation took place the following Monday morning in the executive conference room, with Maria requesting a private meeting with both Blackwood and Hayes to discuss irregularities in the expense reporting systems. She had spent the weekend preparing her presentation with the same attention to detail she brought to studying for final exams, organizing the evidence into clear categories, and anticipating the objections and explanations her colleagues would likely offer. Richard Blackwood's initial response was predictably dismissive, suggesting that Maria's inexperience had led her to misinterpret routine business transactions that she didn't understand. But his confidence began to crack when Maria presented bank records showing the connection between Pinnacle Business Solutions and his personal accounts, along with detailed timelines that correlated the fake consulting payments with his major purchases. The evidence was too comprehensive and well documented to dismiss as misunderstanding or coincidence. The meeting concluded with Maria offering both executives a choice that reflected Walter's preference for resolving problems with dignity whenever possible. They could resign immediately and cooperate with an internal audit to determine the full extent of their financial improprieties, potentially avoiding criminal prosecution in exchange for complete restitution of stolen funds. The impact of her ultimatum was immediate and dramatic. Richard Blackwood's resignation was submitted that afternoon, along with a settlement agreement that included repayment of the $2.3 million stolen through Pinnacle Business Solutions. The H&W Industries boardroom occupied the entire 31st floor, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of Pittsburgh's skyline that spoke to the company's position among the city's corporate elite. 8 leather chairs surrounded a mahogany conference table that had witnessed decades of strategic decisions affecting thousands of employees and millions of dollars in annual revenue. Maria had requested this emergency board meeting 3 days after Richard Blackwood and Jennifer Hayes submitted their resignations, knowing that the remaining executives would use every available weapon to undermine her authority and question Walter's judgment in selecting an inexperienced waitress as his successor. The morning's Pittsburgh Post-Gazette lay folded on the table, its business section featuring a prominent article about the mysterious changes in H&W Industries leadership that had already begun attracting unwanted media attention to the company's internal affairs. The 7 remaining board members filed into the room with expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed hostility, their expensive suits and confident bearing creating an atmosphere of intimidation that might have overwhelmed someone less prepared for corporate warfare. Board Chairman Douglas Whitman, a silver-haired veteran of Pittsburgh's business establishment, took his seat at the head of the table with the kind of authoritative presence that had served him well during 40 years of merger negotiations and hostile takeover battles. Maria had studied each board member's background extensively over the past week, using Walter's files to understand their personal interests, political alignments, and potential motivations for supporting or opposing her leadership. She knew that today's meeting would determine not just her immediate future at H&W Industries, but whether Walter's vision for ethical corporate governance would survive his death. Richard Blackwood had not gone quietly into retirement as Maria had hoped he would after their confrontation the previous week. Instead, he had hired Cumberland & Associates, one of Pittsburgh's most prestigious law firms, to challenge both Maria's inheritance and her authority to make personnel decisions affecting senior management. His lawyers had filed a formal complaint with the board of directors, arguing that Maria lacked the education experience and professional qualifications necessary to manage a company of H&W Industries' size and complexity. The legal challenge was carefully crafted to avoid direct accusations of fraud or corruption, instead focusing on procedural questions about Walter's mental competency during his final months and the validity of a bequest that seemed to defy standard business succession practices. "Ladies and gentlemen," Chairman Whitman began, his voice carrying the measured authority of someone accustomed to controlling difficult conversations. "We are here to address serious questions about the future leadership of H&W Industries. Questions that affect not only our shareholders, but the 1,500 employees who depend on this company for their livelihoods. Mr. Blackwood's legal counsel has raised concerns about the circumstances surrounding Walter Hartwell's final testamentary decisions, and we have a fiduciary responsibility to examine these matters with appropriate diligence." The chairman's tone was neutral, but Maria could sense the undercurrent of skepticism that pervaded the room as board members exchanged glances that suggested they viewed her presence as an unfortunate complication rather than Walter's carefully considered choice. Blackwood's attorney, a sharp-featured woman in her 50s named Patricia Cumberland, presented her client's case with the kind of polished aggression that commanded attention in corporate boardrooms throughout Pennsylvania. She argued that Walter's decision to leave 40% of his company to someone with no relevant business experience represented either a serious lapse in judgment or evidence of diminished mental capacity during his final years. Ms. Santos is undoubtedly a person of good character, Cumberland conceded with the kind of backhanded compliment that trial lawyers specialized in delivering. But good character alone does not qualify someone to manage a $400 million corporation that employs hundreds of skilled professionals and serves hospitals throughout the eastern United States. Mr. Blackwood's dismissal was premature and based on incomplete information that Santos may have misinterpreted due to her limited understanding of complex corporate financial structures. The attorney's presentation included character witnesses who testified to Blackwood's professional competence and community-standing financial experts who questioned Maria's ability to understand sophisticated accounting procedures and legal precedents, suggesting that dramatic changes in corporate leadership should be subject to board oversight rather than individual discretion. Cumberland's strategy was clear paint Maria as well-intentioned but fundamentally unqualified, while positioning Blackwood as a victim of inexperience and overzealousness rather than a perpetrator of systematic fraud. The presentation was professionally polished and superficially convincing, designed to exploit the board members' natural reluctance to entrust their company's future to someone whose primary qualification was serving coffee to their deceased founder. Maria's response drew upon everything she had learned during her weeks of intensive preparation, combining the forensic accounting skills she had developed in community college with the systematic attention to detail that Walter had recognized and cultivated during their breakfast conversations. She began with a PowerPoint presentation that methodically documented the financial irregularities she had discovered using bank records, email correspondence, and contract analysis to build an irrefutable case against both Blackwood and Hayes. Each slide contained specific dollar amounts, dates, and supporting documentation that transformed abstract accusations into concrete evidence of systematic theft and corruption. The presentation took 45 minutes to complete, during which the boardroom remained absolutely silent, except for the soft clicking of Maria's laptop keyboard and the occasional rustle of papers as board members took notes. The evidence was devastating in its scope and precision. $2.3 million in fraudulent consulting fees paid to Blackwood's shell companies over 18 months. Supply contracts negotiated by Hayes that included kickbacks disguised as legitimate business expenses totaling an additional $1.7 million in unnecessary costs. Email correspondence between the two executives discussing strategies for maximizing their personal profits from H&W Industries operations, while minimizing the risk of detection by Walter or the board of directors. Bank records showing luxury purchases that far exceeded what either executive's legitimate salary could support, including Blackwood's vacation home in the Hamptons and Hayes' investment in a restaurant chain owned by her relatives. The mathematics are straightforward. Maria explained, her voice steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through her system as she reached the climax of her presentation. Mr. Blackwood and Ms. Hayes have systematically stolen over $4 million from this company over the past 2 years, money that belonged to our shareholders and should have been invested in research and development, employee benefits, and facility improvements. This is not a matter of interpretation or inexperience. This is documented theft that would have continued indefinitely if Walter had not begun investigating their activities before his death. The boardroom remained silent as Maria clicked to her final slide, which showed side-by-side photographs of the executive's luxury purchases and H&W Industries employees working on the factory floor. Chairman Whitman's questions focused on the technical aspects of Maria's investigation, testing her understanding of corporate accounting procedures and legal standards for evidence gathering. His inquiries were sharp and challenging, but Maria's responses demonstrated both competence and confidence that surprised board members who had expected to find an overwhelmed young woman in over her head. She explained how she had verified the authenticity of bank records through multiple independent sources, how she had confirmed the non-existence of supposed consulting services through direct contact with claimed vendors and how she had used Walter's private investigator files to corroborate her own findings with professional surveillance reports that had been gathered over months of careful observation. The turning point came when Maria presented her proposals for using the recovered funds to benefit H&W Industries employees and the broader Pittsburgh community. Rather than simply returning the stolen money to general corporate accounts, she suggested establishing an employee profit-sharing program that would distribute 15% of annual profits directly to workers based on their length of service and performance evaluations. The remaining recovered funds would finance a community health initiative providing free medical screenings in underserved neighborhoods using H&W Industries medical equipment and partnering with local hospitals to identify health problems before they became serious enough to require expensive emergency room treatment. Walter believed that corporations have responsibilities that extend beyond generating profits for shareholders. Maria explained her passion for these proposals, evident in her voice, as she described programs that would strengthen employee loyalty, while enhancing the company's reputation throughout Western Pennsylvania. These initiatives will generate long-term value that far exceeds their initial costs by reducing employee turnover, improving our relationships with healthcare providers who purchase our equipment, and demonstrating our commitment to the communities where our workers live and raise their families. This is not charity. This is strategic investment in sustainable business practices that will ensure H&W Industries remains competitive and profitable for decades to come. The board's deliberation lasted 2 hours, during which Maria waited in Walter's office, reviewing the notes he had left about each board member's priorities and concerns. When Chairman Whitman finally called her back to the boardroom, his expression was unreadable. But the atmosphere had shifted in ways that suggested serious consideration of her proposals rather than dismissive skepticism. "Ms. Santos." He began, his voice carrying new respect that had been absent from the morning's proceedings. "The board has voted unanimously to support your findings regarding Mr. Blackwood and Ms. Hayes, and we commend your thorough investigation of what appears to be systematic fraud that could have seriously damaged this company's financial stability and reputation." The vote of confidence was accompanied by formal authorization for Maria to implement her employee profit-sharing program and community health initiative, along with board approval for her transition from executive trainee to chief executive officer effective immediately. The legal challenges filed by Blackwood's attorneys were dismissed as frivolous attempts to avoid accountability for documented criminal behavior, and the board authorized H&W Industries' legal department to pursue both civil recovery and criminal prosecution to ensure that justice was served and company assets were fully protected. Maria's transformation from waitress to CEO was complete, but she understood that her real work was just beginning. The news of Maria's appointment as CEO of H&W Industries spread through Pittsburgh's business community like ripples from a stone dropped in still water, generating reactions that ranged from curiosity to skepticism to grudging admiration for the young woman who had engineered such a dramatic corporate transformation. The Pittsburgh Business Times featured her story on its front page under the headline, "From Coffee Shop to Corner Office, the Unlikely Rise of Maria Santos," while the Wall Street Journal's regional correspondent filed a longer piece examining what her success might mean for traditional corporate succession practices. Maria found herself fielding interview requests from business magazines and local television stations, all eager to understand how a community college student had managed to outmaneuver seasoned executives and assume control of a $400 million corporation. The federal investigation into Richard Blackwood and Jennifer Hayes proceeded with the methodical efficiency that characterized white-collar crime prosecutions in the Western District of Pennsylvania. FBI agents armed with search warrants had seized records from Pinnacle Business Solutions and the other shell companies that Blackwood had used to launder stolen funds, while forensic accountants worked to trace every dollar that had been diverted from H&W Industries accounts over the past 3 years. The evidence Maria had gathered provided prosecutors with a roadmap for building their case, but additional documentation emerged that revealed the fraud had been even more extensive than initially suspected. Hayes's supply contract manipulations alone had cost the company over $2.7 million, while Blackwood's consulting schemes had generated nearly $3 million in fraudulent payments that would never have been detected without Maria's careful analysis. The morning brought a phone call that marked the beginning of Richard Blackwood's legal reckoning when his attorney informed the U.S. Attorney's Office that his client was prepared to plead guilty to charges of conspiracy to commit fraud and money laundering in exchange for cooperation with the ongoing investigation. The plea agreement required Blackwood to forfeit all assets purchased with stolen funds, including his vacation home in the Hamptons and the luxury vehicles he had acquired during his tenure as CFO. More importantly for H&W Industries, the agreement included full restitution of the fraudulent consulting fees, ensuring that every dollar would be returned to company accounts, along with interest and penalties that reflected the true cost of his crimes. Jennifer Hayes initially attempted to fight the charges through an expensive legal defense that focused on arguing that her supply contract arrangements had been legitimate business decisions rather than criminal conspiracies. Her attorneys hired expert witnesses to testify about industry standards for vendor relationships and retained public relations consultants to manage media coverage that might influence potential jurors. But when additional evidence emerged showing that Hayes had received over $1 million in payments from companies that had been awarded H&W Industries contracts based on her recommendations, her position became untenable. Her plea agreement followed within 2 weeks, accompanied by asset forfeiture and restitution requirements that would ensure complete financial accountability for her crimes. The recovered funds provided Maria with resources to implement the employee benefit programs she had proposed to the board of directors. But she approached these initiatives with the same systematic methodology that had characterized her investigation of the financial fraud. The employee profit-sharing program required careful design to ensure fairness and sustainability, with participation based on objective criteria, including length of service performance evaluations and contributions to workplace safety and quality control. Rather than simply distributing money according to salary levels, Maria worked with the Human Resources Department to create a formula that rewarded loyalty and excellence, while encouraging the kind of collaborative behavior that would strengthen H&W Industries' competitive position in increasingly challenging markets. The Community Health Initiative represented a more complex undertaking that required partnerships with local hospitals, coordination with public health agencies, and careful planning to ensure that free medical screenings would reach the people who needed them most. Maria spent weeks meeting with administrators from Allegheny General Hospital, UPMC Presbyterian, and smaller community clinics throughout western Pennsylvania, explaining how H&W Industries' diagnostic equipment could be used to identify health problems before they required expensive emergency room treatment. The program would operate mobile screening units in underserved neighborhoods, providing blood pressure checks, diabetes testing, and basic cardiac assessments that could detect serious conditions early enough for preventive intervention. The transformation of H&W Industries' corporate culture extended beyond new benefit programs to include fundamental changes in management philosophy and operational procedures. Maria instituted monthly meetings where employees at all levels could raise concerns about workplace conditions, suggest improvements to manufacturing processes, and propose innovations that might enhance product quality or operational efficiency. The feedback sessions revealed problems that had been festering for years under the previous management structure, including safety concerns that had been ignored, supply chain inefficiencies that had increased costs unnecessarily, and customer service issues that had damaged relationships with key accounts. The decision to repurchase Sunrise Diner came after weeks of careful consideration about how Maria wanted to honor Walter's memory while maintaining connections to the community that had shaped her character. The development company that had planned to demolish the building for luxury condominiums agreed to sell the property to H&W Industries for $2.8 million, a price that reflected the gentrification pressures affecting working-class neighborhoods throughout Pittsburgh. Rather than simply preserving the diner as a sentimental gesture, Maria envisioned transforming it into a community resource center that would provide job training programs, financial literacy classes, and small business development services for residents who might otherwise lack access to such opportunities. Rick Morrison's reaction to Maria's offer was a mixture of disbelief and gratitude that reflected his genuine affection for the young woman who had once balanced plates of eggs and bacon while studying accounting textbooks during slow periods. "I never thought I'd see this place again," he admitted as they walked through the empty dining room where Walter had spent his final mornings reading the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette and watching Maria serve coffee to neighbors who had become like family. The renovation plans would preserve the diner's essential character while adding computer stations, meeting rooms, and a small library that would serve residents throughout the surrounding neighborhood. Rick would return as general manager, but his responsibilities would expand to include coordinating the educational programs and community services that would operate alongside the traditional restaurant functions. The employee reactions to their new CEO reflected a mixture of relief optimism and healthy skepticism about whether Maria's promised changes would actually materialize in meaningful ways. The factory workers who had been most directly affected by the previous management's cost-cutting measures expressed appreciation for the profit-sharing program and improved safety protocols, while engineers and technicians welcomed the increased investment in research and development that Maria had authorized using the recovered fraud proceeds. The administrative staff, who had worked most closely with Blackwood and Hayes, required more time to adjust to new leadership approaches that emphasized transparency and collaborative decision-making rather than top-down control and bureaucratic secrecy. The quarterly earnings report that Maria released 3 months after assuming the CEO position demonstrated that H&W Industries' financial performance had actually improved following the removal of corrupt executives and the implementation of more efficient operational procedures. Revenue had increased by 12%, compared to the same period in the previous year, while operational costs had decreased by 8% due to elimination of fraudulent expenses and renegotiation of supply contracts on terms that benefited the company rather than individual executives. The profit-sharing distributions to employees totaled over $1.2 million, representing the largest bonus payments in H&W Industries' history, while still leaving substantial funds for reinvestment in equipment upgrades and facility improvements. The Community Health Initiative launched its first mobile screening unit on a crisp October morning in Homewood, a predominantly African-American neighborhood, where access to preventive health care had been limited by poverty and insurance barriers. The converted recreational vehicle was equipped with H&W Industries' latest diagnostic equipment and staffed by volunteer nurses and technicians who had been trained to conduct basic health assessments that could identify serious conditions requiring follow-up care. During the first month of operation, the program screened over 800 residents and identified 67 cases of undiagnosed diabetes, 43 cases of hypertension requiring immediate treatment, and 12 cases of cardiac irregularities that warranted emergency intervention. The success of these initiatives generated positive media coverage that helped restore H&W Industries' reputation following the scandals involving Blackwood and Hayes, while also establishing Maria as a business leader whose approach to corporate responsibility resonated with both employees and community stakeholders. The Pittsburgh Chamber of Commerce invited her to speak at their annual leadership conference, while the Pennsylvania Association of Manufacturers asked her to join their board of directors as the youngest member in the organization's history. But Maria remained focused on the day-to-day responsibilities of managing a complex corporation while preserving the ethical standards that Walter had spent decades establishing and defending. As autumn progressed toward winter, Maria found herself settling into routines that balanced the demands of corporate leadership with the personal values that had attracted Walter's attention during their breakfast conversations at Sunrise Diner. She maintained her practice of eating lunch in the company cafeteria rather than the executive dining room, allowing her to stay connected with employees at all levels of the organization. Her office door remained open during specified hours each week, encouraging direct communication that bypassed traditional bureaucratic channels. Most importantly, she continued to approach every decision with the same careful attention to detail and ethical consideration that had characterized her investigation of the financial fraud that had threatened H&W Industries' integrity and future prosperity. 1 year after Walter Hartwell's death, Maria Santos stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of the CEO's office on the 28th floor of H&W Industries, watching the first snowfall of winter dust. Pittsburgh's steel bridges and brick neighborhoods with crystalline precision. The city spread below her like a living testament to American industrial resilience, its smokestacks and riverfront warehouses speaking to generations of workers who had built their lives around the rhythms of manufacturing and the promise that honest labor would be rewarded with dignity and opportunity. The transformation of her own life still felt surreal at moments like this, when the magnitude of responsibility settling on her shoulders seemed too large for someone who had been counting tip money and worrying about tuition payments just 12 months earlier. The mahogany desk that had once belonged to Walter bore the subtle traces of her daily routines: a ceramic coffee mug from Sunrise Diner filled with black coffee, 2 slices of wheat toast cut diagonally on a simple white plate, and the morning edition of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, folded open to the business section. These small rituals connected her to the memory of their breakfast conversations while grounding her current responsibilities in the values that had guided their relationship from the beginning. The coffee was the same brand Walter had preferred, brewed strong and served without sugar or cream, while the toast represented her commitment to maintaining simple pleasures despite the complexity of corporate leadership. The newspaper provided daily reminders that business decisions had consequences extending far beyond quarterly earnings reports and shareholder dividends. The silver key that Walter had given her during their final conversation now hung in a place of honor on the office wall, mounted in a custom frame, beneath a small brass plaque that read, "In memory of Walter Hartwell, kindness opens every door." The inscription had been Maria's idea, reflecting her understanding that Walter's greatest gift had not been the financial inheritance or corporate authority, but the recognition that moral character could be translated into practical power when guided by wisdom and supported by institutional resources. The key served as a daily reminder that every door she opened in her role as CEO should lead toward decisions that honored Walter's faith in her judgment while advancing the welfare of employees, customers, and communities that depended on H&W Industries for their prosperity. The morning brought a familiar ritual that had evolved from necessity into deliberate practice as Maria prepared for the weekly meeting with department heads that had become the cornerstone of her collaborative management approach. The conference room filled with engineers, accountants, production supervisors, and marketing specialists who had initially viewed her appointment with skepticism but had gradually come to respect her methodical decision-making process and genuine concern for their professional development. The agenda focused on operational improvements that could enhance both efficiency and employee satisfaction, reflecting Maria's belief that the two objectives were complementary rather than competing priorities in well-managed organizations. The discussion that morning centered on proposals for expanding H&W Industries' research and development capabilities through partnerships with Carnegie Mellon University and the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center collaborations that would provide access to cutting-edge technology while creating internship opportunities for students from backgrounds similar to Maria's own. The initiatives required significant investment, but preliminary projections suggested they would generate substantial returns through improved product quality and accelerated innovation cycles that would strengthen the company's competitive position in evolving healthcare markets. More importantly for Maria, these partnerships would demonstrate H&W Industries' commitment to supporting educational advancement for young people who might otherwise lack access to career opportunities in science and technology fields. The afternoon schedule included a meeting that carried particular emotional significance as Maria prepared to welcome the first class of scholarship recipients from the Walter Hartwell Foundation, an endowment she had established using a portion of her inheritance to support students pursuing degrees in accounting, engineering, and business administration. The 12 recipients represented community colleges and universities throughout Western Pennsylvania with selection criteria that emphasized financial need, academic performance, and demonstrated commitment to ethical business practices. Each student would receive full tuition support along with mentorship opportunities that connected them with H&W Industries professionals who could provide guidance about career development and workplace expectations. The scholarship ceremony took place in the same boardroom where Maria had confronted Richard Blackwood and Jennifer Hayes, but the atmosphere today was celebratory rather than adversarial, filled with proud families and nervous students who were experiencing their first exposure to corporate environments. Maria's remarks to the group emphasized that education was not just about acquiring technical skills, but about developing the judgment and character necessary to use those skills in ways that benefited society rather than simply advancing personal interests. Walter taught me that knowledge without wisdom is dangerous, she explained to the young faces looking up at her with mixtures of curiosity and aspiration. But wisdom without the courage to act on it is merely academic exercise. Her mother's evening call from El Paso provided a grounding perspective. Carmen Santos called every Tuesday at 8, maintaining their weekly routine through years of separation and struggle. Tonight included updates about the neighborhood, her improving health, and pride in Maria's accomplishments she still struggled to comprehend. "Mija," her mother said in their familiar Spanish-English mix. "I read about you in the newspaper again. I don't understand the business words, but I understand you're helping people, and that's what matters most." The letter arrived by special delivery as Maria prepared to leave a final document from attorney Thomas Henderson that Walter had instructed be delivered exactly 1 year after his death. Written in Walter's familiar cursive, it began, "My dear Maria, if you are reading this, then you have successfully navigated the first year of responsibilities that I knew would test every aspect of your character and capabilities." Walter's letter reflected on success and the obligations of power and wealth. "Money and authority are tools," he wrote, "and their value depends entirely on the skill and intention of the person wielding them. You have proven you understand this as a practical guide for daily decisions affecting real people. This understanding is rarer than you might imagine, and represents the true inheritance I have tried to leave you." The final paragraph assessed Maria's first year. "You have demonstrated that kindness is not weakness, that integrity is not naivety, and that concern for others can coexist with fierce determination to achieve excellence. These lessons cannot be taught in business schools, they must be lived and practiced until they become as natural as breathing." As evening settled over Pittsburgh, Maria returned to her contemplation window. The city lights reflected off 3 rivers that had defined the region for centuries, their confluence symbolizing how different elements could combine into something larger than individual components. The view reminded her that her success was built not just on Walter's guidance, but on contributions from employees, customers, partners, and family who had believed in her potential even when she doubted herself. The decision to return to Sunrise Diner for dinner was deliberate, a choice to maintain connections with the community and values that had shaped her character. The renovated space retained its neighborhood character while adding meeting rooms, computer stations, and a small library for local residents. Rick Morrison greeted her with warmth, insisting on personally preparing her order despite other staff being available. Walter's corner booth remained unchanged, its worn vinyl and scratched table bearing witness to countless neighborhood stories. Maria sat facing Carson Street, watching evening commuters hurry past under familiar streetlights. The contrast between her current circumstances and the anxieties that had consumed her just 12 months earlier felt both dramatic and natural, as if Walter's faith in her potential had always been more realistic than her own self-doubts. Rick brought coffee in the same ceramic mug she had used during her waitressing shifts, its familiar weight connecting her to memories of early mornings when her biggest worry was covering her mother's prescription costs. Sitting in Walter's booth with that familiar mug, Maria felt a continuity that transcended her material circumstances, reminding her that the values guiding her CEO decisions were the same ones that had first earned Walter's attention. As she prepared to leave for home, where financial reports and strategic plans awaited, Maria understood that Walter's greatest gift hadn't been the company or money, but recognizing that ordinary kindness could become extraordinary power when supported by resources and guided by ethical principles. The key had unlocked more than his office door. It had revealed that true success was measured by positive changes in other people's lives. Snow continued falling as Maria walked to her car, dusting Pittsburgh's streets with winter beauty that made the city feel both intimate and eternal. Tomorrow would bring new challenges to prove Walter's faith justified, but tonight she carried quiet satisfaction knowing that kindness had opened every door that mattered, and the best way to honor his memory was continuing to open doors for others.